So who's going to kick us off with either an observation, question, or a response of some kind?
I'll do it.
Go, Hannah.
So we were talking a little bit about, we were really inspired by the waiting posture, the being slow, patient, that kind of thing. But I think we were talking about how do you do that in a way that's, so like if you're running a marathon, you're plodding, well I'm plodding, really slowly.
Yes.
And how are you, but if God does something over here and you're plodding in that direction, how are you actively waiting so you can be aware of something new? And we were talking about this kind of thing that seems to be happening in churches where like 16 to 30s are just turning up randomly for no reason, which is amazing.
Yeah.
And I was observing that I hadn't noticed it until someone told me, oh, this is happening. I was like, oh yeah, no, it's happening in my church. Oh, I hadn't thought about that. Because I was over here plodding in that direction. So how do we have a patience, but also an alertness to the new thing that God might be doing that's not expected?
So my question for you would be, in what way did you become alert to that?
By going to a conference and someone said this is happening, and the guy, it was amazing. The guy sat at the front, room full of vicars.
Was it James Lawrence?
No, it was I don't know his name, some bloke from London.
Yeah. Well, it was,
but he said it in this conference. It was a room full of vicars, and he said, "Who's seen that in their church?" And a third of vicars put their hands up, and I was like, "Oh, this is happening. That's amazing."
Yeah. But so, I mean, I don't have the answer for you, but I think hanging out physically with people and being in conversation, that's why, I've really pushed people to make sure you're here in person. Because the stuff that happens in the conversation when you're in the room, that just doesn't happen anywhere else. So our conference, 10th of June, we are not doing it online. The only way you can participate in that conference is to come in person. Because I just believe that the things that happen in a face-to-face conversation that cannot happen any other way, there is a magic and a power that happens and things that you get alert to that, and it's often sometimes in the sidelines. I mean, maybe from a sort of somebody up on the thing, but there's a conversation you go, oh yeah, I don't know, that's, I have not got the answer for you, but finding ways to make sure we reconnect and actually gather in person with people. For me, that is one key thing, I think.
But just to follow on from that, I think that was where we were also talking about, that sort of sense of slowing down and waiting patiently on God and not trying this contemporary thing of driving to acceleration. Yeah. And I missed your third point because you rushed on. Surely not. I just need that one.
Nobody's ever accused me of going too fast.
Well, that sort of sense of just being present and that lovely thing about being the blessing. And if you are just you're sitting, you're being present, you can actually discover how you can be a blessing and also to receive blessing from others around you. So.
Yeah. Well, and so you will get the book chapter and we will also have a video of my presentation, so you'll be able to revisit it if you missed it. No. And you'll even be able to share the presentation with friends, because it'll be on our website. But yeah, no, absolutely. But I mean, there is something deeply countercultural about slowing down. And so, for me, part of that is having a discipline which forces me to slow down. So going regularly on retreat, where I switch off my phones, that is a really key discipline to kind of slow down, just attend to God. And whatever the disciplines are for yourself, going and walking up on the Malvern Hills Ridge, that for me is a key discipline, and I'll try and do it 4 or 5 times on a good week. We have to find out those ways for ourselves. Okay, a different table. Who wants to offer something?
I'll just build on it.
Yeah, go on,
which
Matthew.
was just around the tension, and this is a sort of prophetic calling, a bit about pace again and a bit about space, was how you kind of embed that in a church which is fairly obsessed with the short term, even though when we go back 50 years we were more obsessed with the long term because you had Parsons Freehold and all those sorts of things, but we're fairly obsessed with the short term. How you actually sell that, really. I mean, you evidenced it, which you have, but actually there are quite a lot of pressures in all sorts of other directions on us which say, we need to I don't know, just to speak into that tension really.
Yeah, but so, I mean, part of what I'm hearing there, Matthew, is how do we resist that pressure that comes down from on high, from the diocesan system, which goes, you've got to deliver X or Y, or am I misreading?
No, there's some truth there, but I mean, I think as well, it's held alongside part of the calling of the churches to make disciples as well as to serve the communities that we're in, and again, holding that tension seems to me to be just around in the questions that are going around in my head.
Yeah, and so, I mean, that was why I included the Nancy Ammerman quote.
Yeah.
Because you're always having to do both and.
Yeah.
You know, the bit I'm most excited about is the bit the church has historically neglected.
Yeah.
And there's lots of resources for helping us to grow disciples. There's less in terms of that, the way we engage with the local neighbourhood and community. So that's obviously why there's that so much of a focus on that within this. But you've got to do both and there's some great resources out there to be able to do that nurturing of disciples. And from different traditions, you know. You may want to do Alpha, but you know, you might want to do the Being With course that Sam Wells has developed at Smart and Fields, which is a completely different approach to kind of helping people on a road or a journey. And there's a whole range of other things in between those two. I don't know. I mean, come back if there's more you want to sort of push back on there.
No, I'm quite happy with that, and I can see this as a counter to where we've been. We talked about it being the church has been in its head quite a lot of the time rather than being embodied, and I kind of get that. I think it's just, it's just that tension and the difficult conversations around the long term and the short, and actually seeing ourselves as a church of the long term as well as the short term. And you know, I just use the example. How many of us have been anywhere? But I mean, I'm an exception, and you maybe are. I was in my last parish for 10 years, but most of us will have done 5, 6, 7 years. That's not quite, doesn't fit with the timescale we were talking about, does it? Yeah. It's interesting.
No, I'm really interesting that Al Barrett has chosen not to move. You know, he's been there over 13 years now. But the dividends that come from being really rooted and grounded in one place over time, really significant. Now, you know, you always have to discern, you know, have I basically run out of what I've got to offer in this context? Is it better for the parish and better for me if I move on? You know, I'm not saying you always need to stay long, but yeah.
And it's what's going on when you're staying there long. So in my parish, historically, the priest was there for 39 years, one of them, but they will say that it wasn't so much about staying prayerfully and with patience and waiting on God, but kind of had just did the day-to-day and nothing else, and it was like a dead space really for a very long time. So it's getting that balance right. It's knowing when your gut is saying, I've done what I can here, and then time to move.
Absolutely, and things can get ossified when somebody is too long in a place. And unless you have some intentional interim ministry after a long ministry, whoever comes afterwards can be a de facto intentional interim ministry, because all of those stuff that has not got resolved suddenly, you know, comes out. So that there's definitely there's a sort of an appropriateness of, you know, if you haven't renewed yourself and your vision for the place where you are, then maybe you do need to move on for the benefit of the community. Which tables haven't we heard from?
Our discussion was around following up very similar thing to Matthew about, you know, Jesus told us to go and make disciples, baptising them in the name of the Father. And, you know, I'm completely signed up to community work and engagement in the community because that's what I used to do. But it is the tension. And sometimes it's about walking a bridge, which is a bit of a dangerous place to be. Because bridges tend to be bouncy. And uncertain and unsecure. And so it's a question of pointing which way do you point.
And I guess part of the question I have is, what's the discipleship that we're calling people into? You know, can somebody genuinely be a Christian disciple without being involved and engaged with the local community?
I don't know the answer to that.
I mean, my sense is you can't really, you know, discipleship is not about disengagement from the...
But you're making a definition of discipleship which may not be everybody's.
Absolutely.
That's my problem with that.
Absolutely. No, people are definitely going to disagree with me. I mean, that's...
I mean, I would say, yeah, no, they couldn't. You know, it is engaging with the community. But, yeah, I just don't want to say that.
It depends what they
Yeah, I'm
engage in,
prepared
though,
to
doesn't it?
put the colours on my
Sorry,
mind.
yeah.
Go on, Karen.
It depends. If they're not engaged in the local community, it doesn't mean they're not engaged in their own. So if they're engaged,
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, okay, so that engagement can find expression through an organisation involvement that's doing
Yeah.
some national work.
Yeah.
or in a secular workplace.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
But, you know, helping them to see that is part of the vocational journey that God's called them on. And this is part of their discipleship, is exercising their discipleship in that context. That's different to, you know, here's your God bit over here, here's the rest of your life over there. There's something about integrating all of that in, which needs to happen.
Yeah, I think for too long we've equated a Sunday congregation member as being a disciple, and the danger with that is that we can think that simply someone who might have attended the past as being a transformed apprentice of Jesus. That's not necessarily been the case for lots of people, and now perhaps we're rethinking, well, what does discipleship look like, and how do we help people on that journey in a more coherent way, maybe?
Yeah. I'm with you, Richard, on that, definitely. Something from this table conversation?
So I basically had quite a strong reaction against what we were saying about the leadership and what and the type of leadership that's required. I think because what I see in Al and Paul I think they undervalue their own contribution. That they bring actually an extraordinary visionary and prophetic leadership in that situation. And they say, it says in the case study, you know, that they say, the measure of our effectiveness is actually if we ever move on, how far does the thing continue? And I think that it might well continue for a while, but they'll always look back to, these great guys that we had that really helped us and pushed us forward and carried the culture and the vision for this thing in a way that was profoundly helpful for the whole, to allow the whole thing to flourish under their leadership. And so there's a tension in there, isn't there? I think we're saying, yes, of course, you know, let's give away, they're brilliant at giving away authority, giving away power, but really they are crucial in the middle of the thing, holding the vision.
I think that's true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the baton can't be handed on.
Yeah.
And so, you know, what the selection process is for Al's replacement at whatever point Al goes, and how that person is discerned, to me is a key thing about what is going to get sustained beyond Al's ministry.
Yes, yeah, but I think it would also be okay to say, to allow something to die at that point as well.
Absolutely, no, and I will be with you.
Yeah.
Absolutely, we should not be frightened of death, and there are things that do need to die. You know, there are a lot of things in the Church of England that need to die before the new thing is going to come to life, and we should not be frightened of death.
And so I suppose I'm hoping I'm not coming across as negative, because I think actually it's almost like we were saying, it's almost like a personality trait of this type of leader, is that they undervalue their own contribution.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Al would undervalue it, and Paul certainly doesn't. But he says, you know, you've got to notice the type of leadership that Al has provided here, and look at the leaders who have been raised up through his ministry. You know, the exponential sort of blossoming of leadership in that context is extraordinary.
Yeah.
And how many of us can say that when we leave the parish where we are?
And that's even more saying what an incredible leader he is, rather than that he's just giving it all away.
But you know, it's not unique what he does. Yeah. Others can do it. We can do it. But there's learning to operate in a different leadership model, the leadership models that the Church of England has favoured over the years, which, you know, can sit a bit uncomfortably with some of this.
One of the key things there is what voices are being heard in the communities where they're working. If they're giving space and preserving the integrity and confidence of people who are not like them to be able to speak up. That will be transformative in the way the community moves forward.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Who haven't we yet heard from?
The last one
Go on.
relates to what voices are being heard.
Go on.
And this was Mark's point, but relating to point 5 about challenging systematic issues. And we just wonder whether we do, as an established church, have privileges, as in bishops sitting in the House of Lords, and are we using our voices appropriately well enough to bring about systematic change?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there's a really interesting tension there of being part of the system and looking to challenge the system. And, you know, I've got very, very deeply mixed feelings about the church being the established church and all that comes with that. And, yeah, about how we use the power and privilege that we have. I think there's some really big questions on that. Whether we might not actually be better off without all of that power and privilege, and our voices might be better heard. I don't know, there's some really interesting things to kind of tussle with.
I would just question there whether we're actually making use of it as part of the problem.
Okay.
So, for example, we have a synodical system where parish levels are supposed to raise issues from a very local level upwards, and I just don't see it happening very often. But there are examples when you do hear it where it's actually quite exciting. Like I think it was from Blackburn Diocese where they had the proposal about effectively having a pay-as-you-feel structure for weddings, because they were noticing just in some ways the injustice and we're effectively saying you can't get married unless you can afford it. You know, that's a great example of actually something coming from a community basis and kind of working through that system. I just wonder how much we actually make use of the fact that, you know, we often have really good connections with things like local councillors and stuff like that, maybe some relationship with MPs, but actually, you know, there are bishops who have better and closer relationships and things with MPs in government that can take stories that, if are put before them, and I think they often want the stories, to be able to raise issues. And if we're not making use of those gifts that we have, and just almost like looking back to removing ourselves from that and campaigning, in some ways it's a real shame. Like actually we do need to be prepared to get within the system as well as be outside the system, and have that voice.
And I think there's definitely bishops do that. I mean, I was having lunch with Rachel Treweek, who's our patron, who's Bishop of Gloucester, and who's the Bishop for Prisons, and who's very involved in the conversations going on in government around how to reform the prison system. But you know, all of that's happening behind closed doors. Yeah. It's not out in the public arena, because that's where influence can be exercised, is in deep and significant conversations where it's not, you know, is this a soundbite the BBC are going to snap up? It's about, okay, so, you know, how are you going to change things really to create the change that we need to see in the way, you know, the prison system works? So I think some of that is happening, but it's not necessarily in public view.
Can we ask the bishop?
But I think the other thing I'd say is I don't think we should overload what we put on our bishops. That I think we all need to step up, and we need to encourage our lay people to step up, and that's where the collective action and the collective working is where I think some key power lies. You know, it's then we've got a critical mass of people who are working together that you can help to contribute to change, rather than relying on somebody who's in what may be seen as a position of power. Bishop Smith.
What I was going to say was that we have some really key lead bishops for different areas, and they exercise their responsibilities, and I think take it really, really seriously. So in June you've got Bishop Gully coming to the conference. She majors on housing and what she has done in terms of alerting people about the greenfield site, the brownfield sites, etc., and the lack of housing for groups of people, particularly those who are young, those who are traveller, and have the systemic injustices that you've alluded to have really withdrawn opportunity for those kinds of people. You've got our own bishop, the Bishop of Leeds, leading the Europe inquiry, whispering to the MP Kim Leadbeater, who's brought a major thing to the table about assisted dying. But many of those conversations are happening outside of that debating house. And I think nuance, influence, all of those are really critical in the conversations, because quite often all that people want is like, what are you doing about it? Actually quite a lot. And you've got lead bishops for things like racial justice. You've mentioned Rachel, and that's of course incredible, the work she's doing with prisons. Again, with younger and more diverse, and the stated aims, but bringing those all the time to policymakers and influencers. But I also think, sorry, I should also say, I think there is we get, when we're consecrated, we're given a mitre and a cope and a staff, okay? But what you don't see given to us is a gag as well at times, and I feel it. And there are times, and so pray for us, because the ministry that we exercise, it's mine and yours, yeah, and the different influence that we bear on different situations and groups of people, they vary, and sometimes I must hold back in order to enable you to speak, but there's also the kind of sensitive, judicious, move not to say anything, because silence is more powerful.
Yeah. Okay, great work, people. I think we deserve some lunch, don't you?